Settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket or your favorite pillow. Let the day fade away. We're going to step back, way back, to a world that feels both strangely familiar from myth and legend and utterly alien in its stark reality. We're going to spend some time in the Viking Age, not just observing from a distance, but trying, as much as we can, to feel the spray of the ocean, smell the peat smoke, hear the clang of steel, and maybe, just maybe, understand a little of the mindset that shaped that incredible brutal era, our guide, or perhaps more accurately, our lens. For this journey is a name that echoes through history, myth, and modern television. Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, before we even truly begin, let's address the elephant in the longhouse, Ragnar Lothbrok. The famous Viking king, the father of legendary sons, the bane of Paris and England, is, to put it simply, a figure shrouded in legend. Historical sources from his time mention Viking leaders raiding the places he's famous for, and later sources name some of his alleged sons as very real, very powerful figures. But the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, written down centuries later, is a thrilling, epic, and highly fictionalized account. So, think of Ragnar Lothbrok not as a single, perfectly documented historical person, but as a powerful symbol, a composite figure representing the ambition, the daring, the ruthlessness, and the sheer resilience of the Viking Age. We'll explore the stories of Ragnar, but we'll constantly ground them in the historical reality that we know existed through archaeology, contemporary chronicles, and later, more grounded histories. We'll use his saga as a narrative thread to pull us through the world he supposedly inhabited, examining the life, the dangers, the beliefs, and the sheer physical experience of being alive during that time. It's a world that demands respect, but also a healthy dose of skepticism towards the myths it spawned. It's a world where life was often short, brutal, and unforgiving. A world where sleeping soundly was a luxury, not a given. So, let's begin our journey. Leave the comforts of the 21st century behind for a while. Let's try to understand the life, the legend, and the times of Ragnar Lothbrok. Deep breaths, settle in. The journey is long, and the waves can be rough. But for now, we are just listening. Imagine, if you can, stepping out of a time machine, not into a bustling city, but into a landscape that feels both ancient and raw. It's the early 9th century in Scandinavia. No paved roads, no streetlights, no constant hum of electricity. The air is likely colder than you're used to, carrying the sharp scent of pine forests, the salt tang of the nearby sea, and perhaps the ever-present smell of wood smoke from distant hearths. This is the world Ragnar Lothbrok is said to have entered. Not a unified kingdom of Norway, Sweden, or Denmark as we know them, but a patchwork of smaller territories ruled by chieftains and petty kings. Life here is dictated by the seasons. Long, dark, bitterly cold winters locked down the land, testing endurance. Shorter, intensely vibrant summers exploded with life and the urgent need to grow food, fish, and prepare for the next cold season. Your feet, clad perhaps in simple leather shoes or wrapped hides, feel the uneven ground. Packed dirt, mud, stones. Your clothes are likely wool or linen, maybe animal skins, functional but rough against the skin, carrying the scent of wood smoke. They are constantly exposed to. Society wasn't equal, not by a long shot. At the top were the jarls, the chieftains or nobles. Below them were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen, the backbone of society. And at the bottom were the thralls, the enslaved people who performed the hardest labor and had virtually no rights. Your status was largely determined by birth, though wealth and reputation, especially earned through raiding and warfare, could certainly shift things. The sounds of this world? No cars, no planes. You'd hear the wind whistling through the trees, the cry of gulls near the coast, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the cackle of chickens. Inside a longhouse, the crackling and spitting of the central fire, the murmur of voices, maybe the sound of tools, a hammer on metal, a loom clicking, the scraping of a knife. Outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe cutting wood, the splash of oars, the distant barking of a dog, and the smells. Oh, the smells. Wood smoke was everywhere, clinging to clothes and hair. Animal smells. Livestock in or near the living spaces. The tang of sour milk or fermenting ale. The smell of bodies that weren't washed daily, perhaps only weekly in a sauna or a cold river if you were lucky. The strong scent of fish, fresh or preserved. The earthy smell of the fields. In a wealthy home, maybe the faint exotic smell of spices acquired through trade or raid. In a poor home, just the basics. Fire, animals, people, earth. Food was simple, built around local produce. Barley and rye for porridge and bread. Meat from livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, or hunting. Deer, elk, birds. Fish from the rivers. And sea, essential for protein, often preserved by salting or smoking. Dairy products. Milk, butter, cheese, skyr, a sort of yogurt, root vegetables like cabbage, turnips, carrots if you could grow them, berries and nuts foraged, fermented drinks like ale, low alcohol, and mead, honey wine, were safer to drink than often contaminated water. You ate what was seasonal and what you could preserve. Hunger was a constant threat, especially in late winter. Religion permeated everything. The Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, Tyr, Freyr, and many others, weren't distant figures. They were powerful beings whose actions influenced the world, who needed to be appeased through sacrifices, blot, and honored in daily life. You might wear a Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, amulet for protection, pray to Freyr for a good harvest, or hope Odin smiled upon you in battle. The concept of word, or fate, was deeply ingrained, an inescapable web of destiny. Though your actions within that web still mattered. Death wasn't just an end, it was a transition. Dying well, especially bravely in battle, could lead you to Valhalla, Odin's hall, or Folkvanger, Freya's field, places of honor and feasting for the chosen warriors. A less glorious death might lead to Helheim, the realm of the goddess Hel. This belief system wasn't just spiritual. It had practical implications, encouraging bravery in the face of danger. Technology was robust but focused. Shipbuilding was perhaps their greatest technical achievement. The longship, a marvel of design, shallow drafted for rivers but seaworthy for the open ocean, fast and versatile. Tools for farming, building, and crafting were essential. Weapons were key. Axes, swords, spears, shields, helmets, chainmail for the wealthy or elite. Life in 9th century Scandinavia was one of constant negotiation with the natural world. The weather, the sea, the land's fertility. It demanded resilience, practicality, and a deep understanding of your environment. It was hard, often uncomfortable, and sometimes terrifying. This is the world that forged the people we call Vikings, the world that shaped the legends, and the world where, according to the stories, Ragnar Lothbrok took his first breaths. Now, let's step into the realm of the sagas. These are the stories, told for generations and finally written down centuries after the events they describe, that give us the figure of Ragnar Lothbrok. They are part history, part myth, part heroic epic. The main sagas featuring Ragnar are the tale of Ragnar's sons, Ragnarssona Thatr, and the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar's Saga Lodbrokar. They tell of his lineage, sometimes claiming descent from kings or even gods, and his early exploits. One of the most famous tales is his encounter with a fearsome serpent or dragon that was terrorizing the kingdom of a Swedish earl named Haraldr. This earl had a beautiful daughter, Thora Borgarhjortur, Thora Town Heart. Ragnar, seeking fame and a prestigious marriage, volunteered to kill the beast. The sagas differ slightly, but the core story involves Ragnar creating a suit of clothes, or armor soaked in pitch and rolled in sand or gravel to protect himself from the serpent's venom and bites. This crude, rough protection gave him the nickname Lothbrok, which means shaggy breeches or hairy breeches. A far cry from the image of a gleaming, noble warrior king, but very much in keeping with the practical, slightly rough-around-the-edges reality we're exploring. Imagine the scene from the saga. The air thick with anticipation and fear. The stench of the monster's lair. Ragnar, perhaps young and untested, standing there in his weird, pitch-covered trousers facing down a creature of myth. The roar, the strike, the smell of burning pitch as it bites, the struggle, the brute force, the eventual triumph as Ragnar slays the beast. His reward, of course, is the hand of the fair Thora. But this is just the beginning. Sagas love dramatic relationships. After Thora's death, Ragnar seeks a new wife, and this brings him to Norway and the legendary shield maiden, Lagertha. The sagas describe Lagertha as a fierce warrior who fought alongside men. Ragnar, seeking to marry her, faced challenges and tests, sometimes involving animals or traps set by Lagertha. This is where the idea of the Viking shield maiden comes so strongly into popular culture. Now, let's pause here and dip back into historical reality. Were there women who fought in Viking battles? Archaeological evidence is limited and debated. Some graves contain women buried with weapons, but this doesn't definitively prove they fought. Weapons could be status symbols or heirlooms. Contemporary accounts from outside Scandinavia sometimes mention fearsome women in battle, but these could be exaggerations born of fear or misunderstanding. The idea of the shield maiden was certainly powerful in Norse society and its sagas, representing female strength and independence. The reality is likely more complex. Women managed farms, businesses, and households with incredible capability, and could certainly defend themselves and their homes, but widespread participation in raiding armies is harder to confirm historically. So, Lagertha, as depicted in the sagas, is likely more legendary ideal than historical norm, but her inclusion tells us something about the values and stories important to the people who created these tales. Ragnar's saga continues with his abandonment of Lagertha and his quest for Aslaug, the mysterious daughter of the legendary dragon slayer Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhildr. Their meeting is full of tests and prophecies, including Aslaug's warning about a hidden surprise she carries, their son, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, born with a marking in his eye. Aslaug becomes his primary wife in the sagas and the mother of many of his most famous sons. These early saga tales establish Ragnar as a man destined for greatness, overcoming challenges, winning powerful wives, and siring remarkable children. They paint a picture of a hero, but already you can see the blend of the fantastic, dragon-slaying Valkyrie daughters, with elements that feel grounded, the shaggy breeches nickname, the tests of skill. The stage is set for him to become a major player in the world of Viking expansion. If Ragnar Lothbrok represents the ambition of the Viking Age, the longship represents its beating heart, its essential tool, its home away from home for months at a time. Stepping aboard one of these vessels, even in imagination, is to enter a completely different sensory world. You step over the low gunwale. Carefully, these boats are designed for speed and shallowness, not necessarily stability. When loading, the deck is open, smooth wood planks, perhaps slippery with sea spray or rain. Below the deck, just floorboards really, is the ballast. Stones, maybe sand, helping the ship sit lower in the water. There's no cabin, no shelter, just the open. Sky above and the sea all around. The smell hits you first. Tar, lots of tar, used to waterproof the wood and the ropes, the sharp, clean smell of salt water, the faint, ever-present odor of dried fish or preserved meat, and yes, the smell of many unwashed bodies packed together in a confined space for weeks on end. Hygiene is a luxury you don't have here. You wash, with salt water if you bother. Your clothes are damp and smelly. The sounds are constant and varied. The rhythmic dip and pull of oars as the crew rows, grunt and heave in unison. The slosh and gurgle of water against the hull. When the sail is raised, the flap and snap of the heavy wool or linen canvas in the wind, the creak of the mast and the ropes, the ever-present whisper and roar of the wind itself, the calls of the crew, commands, warnings, maybe a snatch of a song or a saga being recited to pass the time. And at night or in a storm, the terrifying howl of the wind, the crash of waves, breaking over the bow, the groaning protest of the wood. Physically, you feel the constant motion of the sea, the roll, the pitch, the yaw. Your muscles ache from rowing or holding position against the movement. Your skin is chapped by wind and salt spray. You're often cold and damp. Sleeping, you curl up on the deck, maybe under a simple wool blanket, right next to your shipmates, exposed to the elements. There's no privacy. You hear everyone breathing, shifting, snoring. You feel the hard wood beneath you, the cold air on your face, the constant presence of others. Food is basic and repetitive. Hard, dried bread or biscuits. Preserved meat, probably salted or smoked, tough and chewy. Dried fish, maybe some dried berries or nuts if they brought them. Water or ale from leather skins or wooden barrels, often. Lukewarm and stale. Hot food is rare, maybe possible in good weather with a small, carefully managed fire pit on deck, but a huge risk. You eat cold, often bland, food while the boat pitches beneath you. Navigation is done by observing the sun, the stars, the direction of waves, the flight of birds, and, most importantly, experience. There are no charts in the modern sense. The captain, or helmsman, relies on a deep knowledge of coastlines, currents, and celestial signs. Imagine the anxiety of being far from land, reliant on ancient knowledge and a clear sky. A sudden fog or storm could be disastrous. Boredom is a constant companion on long voyages. Days blend together. The horizon is unchanging. You talk, you tell stories, you mend gear, you train, you maybe play simple board games if space allows, but mostly you endure the monotony, punctuated by moments of intense activity. Raising the sail, trimming the ropes, bailing water, rowing hard, or the sudden sharp call that signals land, or perhaps trouble. Despite the discomfort, there's a profound sense of community on a longship. Your life depends on the skill and reliability of everyone else on board. You row together, you fight together, you share meager resources. The ship is a microcosm of their society, a hierarchy, with the captain or chieftain at the top and everyone else pulling their weight. The longship was more than just a boat. It was a mobile platform for their way of life. It allowed them to travel vast distances, to strike quickly and unexpectedly along coasts and up rivers, to carry warriors and plunder. It opened up a world, beyond Scandinavia, offering opportunities for wealth, fame, and survival that the homeland alone couldn't always provide. For a figure like Ragnar, whose legend is built on raiding, the longship was his essential tool, his temporary home, and the source of both great opportunity and immense danger. Now, let's imagine that longship reaching its destination. The monotony of the sea voyage breaks with the cry of "Land ho!" Or maybe, if they know the territory, the sight of a familiar headland or river mouth. The energy on the ship shifts instantly. Boredom gives way to anticipation, tension, adrenaline. One of the most famous raids attributed to Ragnar Lothbrok in the sagas, and a historically significant event that aligns with the timeline of figures claimed as his sons, is the Great Raid on Paris in 845 AD. While historical sources don't name a Ragnar Lothbrok as the sole leader, they do document a massive Viking fleet, led by a chieftain named Ragnar or similar, sailing up the Seine River and besieging Paris. This event fits the saga narrative perfectly and provides a real-world backdrop for Ragnar's legendary achievements. Imagine being on one of those ships, a fleet of potentially over 100 longships carrying thousands of warriors, turning from the open sea into the wide mouth of the Seine. The salt smell of the ocean fades, replaced by the earthier, muddier scent of a great river. The blue-gray of the open sea gives way to the brown-green of river water. The landscape changes. Distant forests and farms on the banks begin to resolve into details. As they sail or row inland, the feeling is one of invasion, of inexorable progress into a land that, while powerful, is fractured and vulnerable. Francia, under King Charles the Bald, is rich, but its defenses are not geared for this kind of swift, amphibious assault. Targets would have been identified beforehand, or scouted from smaller boats. Monasteries and churches were often prime targets. Why? Not necessarily because the Vikings were inherently anti-Christian, though they certainly had no reverence for Christian holy sites or objects, but because monasteries were centers of wealth, gold and silver religious artifacts, illuminated, manuscripts often with precious metal bindings, accumulated treasures from donations. They were also often located in relatively isolated areas and populated by monks and nuns who were not trained warriors. Easy pickings, though incredibly sacrilegious from a Christian perspective. As the fleet progresses up the Seine, the element of surprise might fade. News of the Viking arrival would spread like wildfire, sending people fleeing in terror. You might see smoke on the horizon from villages set ablaze, either by the Vikings or by the inhabitants destroying their own homes rather than letting them fall into enemy hands. Landing is a chaotic burst of energy after the confinement of the ship. Warriors, heavily armed, leaping ashore onto muddy banks or hastily constructed docks, shields ready, axes or swords in hand. The air fills with shouts in Norse, the clatter of weapons, the panicked cries of anyone caught nearby. The smell of fear, sweat, and anticipation is palpable. Marching inland, you'd feel the weight of your armor, the rub of your clothes. The ground is rough. You move fast, driving towards the objective. The sounds change again. The tramp of many feet, the jingle of chainmail, the low murmur of the warband, broken by sharp commands. The raid itself is brutal and terrifying. Imagine the chaos. The sounds of violence, the screams, the clash of metal on metal, the smell of blood, smoke, burning wood, the sight of treasures being seized, buildings being ransacked, people being overwhelmed. For the Viking warrior, it's a blur of adrenaline, focused violence, and the urgent task of survival and plunder. For the victims, it's pure horror. The raid on Paris in 845 AD culminated in a siege. The Parisians, and what few troops Charles, the Bald, could gather, were largely on the Ile de la Cité, the island in the river that was the core of the city. The Vikings surrounded the island, attacked the city's defenses. But this raid didn't end with the city falling entirely to Viking control through conquest. It ended with negotiation. Charles the Bald, unable to defeat the massive Viking force, chose to pay them to leave. This was Danegeld, Dane money, a tribute paid to buy peace. In 845, the payment was immense, 7,000 pounds of silver. Imagine the scene. Negotiations, wary and tense, likely through interpreters or individuals who knew both Norse and Frankish languages. The Vikings, holding the city under duress, demanding a fortune. Charles, weighing the cost of resistance against the cost of payment. For the Vikings, receiving the Danegeld must have been a moment of triumph. Not just the silver itself, a tangible measure of wealth and success, but the symbolic victory of forcing a powerful king to pay them off. Loading the silver onto the ships, the weight shifting the balance slightly. The feeling of accomplishment, the knowledge that you had faced down a major kingdom and emerged rich and victorious. But even success had its costs. The sagas mention that after the raid on Paris, a plague, perhaps dysentery, common when large groups are gathered with poor sanitation, struck Ragnar's men as they returned home, and even Ragnar himself was affected. The triumphant return voyage might have been marred by sickness and death, a stark reminder that the dangers weren't confined to battle. The 845 raid on Paris, whether led by the Saga Ragnar or the historical Regan Harris, set a pattern. It showed that large, coordinated Viking fleets could penetrate deep inland and hold major centers for ransom. It demonstrated the wealth that could be gained, not just through plunder, but through extortion. It was a pivotal moment in the Viking Age, and one that forever cemented the fear and legend of Viking power in the Frankish imagination. It's easy to imagine Vikings were constantly on ships, raiding and conquering. But the reality was that most people, most of the time, were back in Scandinavia, living lives dictated by the rhythms of the land and the seasons. Even a great leader like Ragnar, between his epic voyages described in the sagas, would have returned, home to his estates, his family, and the responsibilities of chieftainship. Leaving the crowded, damp confines of the longship, you step ashore in your homeland. The air smells familiar. Pine, peat smoke, maybe the specific scent of the local. Sure. You feel the solid ground beneath your feet, a welcome relief after weeks or months of constant motion. Life here revolved around the farmstead, the beer. The central structure was the longhouse, a remarkable building typically made of wood, turf, or stone, with a long, rectangular shape. Imagine stepping inside. The first thing that hits you is the smell. The strong, constant odor of peat or wood smoke from the open hearth in the center of the single, large room. This smoke is essential. It provides heat, allows for cooking, preserves meat hanging in the rafters, and helps deter insects. But it also means the air is always smoky, stinging your eyes if you're not used to it, coating everything in a fine layer of soot. The floor is usually packed earth, sometimes with gravel or sand. Along the sides of the room are raised platforms covered with straw, animal skins, or rough blankets. These are the sleeping areas. Everyone sleeps together in this one large room. Family, servants, thralls, though likely in a less desirable spot, maybe visiting guests. There is zero privacy. You hear everyone breathing, shifting, snoring. You feel the heat radiating from the fire, or the chill seeping in from the walls in winter. Animals might even share the space, particularly calves or lambs in winter, adding their own sounds and smells to the mix. Storage pits or chests are built into the floor or walls, holding food, tools, and personal belongings. Light comes primarily from the fire and perhaps a few small openings or oil lamps. It's dim and shadowy even during the day. Daily life is dominated by labor, hard physical work from dawn till dusk, especially during the warmer months. Farming, plowing the fields, using an ard, a simple scratch plow, sowing barley, rye, and oats, harvesting crops with sickles. This is backbreaking work, dependent entirely on favorable weather. A bad harvest means potential starvation. Animal husbandry, tending cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, chickens. Milking, making cheese and butter, shearing sheep for wool, slaughtering for meat, cleaning out stalls. Crafts, everyone contributes. Women spent countless hours processing wool, cleaning, carding, spinning thread on drop spindles, you'd hear the rhythmic whir and click, then weaving fabric on upright looms, the clack-clack of the beater. Men did woodworking, making, and repairing buildings, tools, furniture, ships, metalworking, smithing tools, weapons, jewelry, the clang of the hammer on the anvil, leatherworking, food preparation, grinding grain, kneading dough, baking flatbreads on hot stones or griddles, boiling meat or fish in large pots over the fire, smoking or salting meat and fish for preservation, the constant smell of smoke or brine. Foraging, for berries, nuts, and herbs. Brewing ale. The food you eat reflects the labor. Breakfast might be porridge. Midday and evening meals would be stews, pottage made from grain, vegetables, and meat or fish, or perhaps roasted meat if it was a special occasion. You eat with knives and spoons, or just your hands. It's filling, often bland by modern standards, limited spices, but nourishing if the harvest was good. Hygiene is basic, but perhaps better than the stereotype suggests. While not showering daily with soap, Vikings were known to be relatively clean compared to some contemporaries. Combs are commonly found in graves. Keeping hair and beards tidy was important. Baths were taken, often in a separate small building functioning as a sauna, heating stones and throwing water on them to create steam. Rivers and lakes were used for washing in warmer months. But the smoke, the animal proximity, and the lack of running water or sewage systems mean that a distinct, earthy, slightly smoky smell was the norm. Disease was rampant. Infections, parasites, fevers were constant threats. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and baby. Clothing was practical and layered, mostly wool and linen. Tunics, trousers, often baggy or wrapped, cloaks, leather shoes or boots. Simple designs, but they could be decorated with embroidery, tablet weaving, creating patterned bands, or imported brooches and pins of bronze, silver, or gold, often acquired through trade or acquisition. The feel of wool, sometimes scratchy, was familiar. Social life wasn't just work. Feasts were important, occasions for a chieftain to show generosity, for people to gather, eat, drink, share news, tell stories, sagas, and cement social bonds. The thing was a local or regional assembly, a place where laws were recited. They were not written down until later. Disputes were settled, and justice was administered. This could involve fines, outlawry, being expelled from society, a death sentence, or blood feuds. It was a place of law, but also negotiation and power dynamics. Religious rituals, blot, were performed at specific times of the year, often outdoors at sacred sites involving sacrifices to the gods. Women, though not warriors for the most part, held significant power within the household. The wife was the mistress of the home, holding the keys, a symbol of her authority. She managed the food, the resources, the production of textiles, often oversaw the thralls. If her husband was away raiding or trading, she might manage the entire farm or business. She could own property, inherit wealth, and in some cases, initiate divorce. Their lives were hard and demanding, but they were not without agency. Thralls, the enslaved, were a dark reality of this society. Captured on raids, born into slavery, or sometimes self-sold due to debt. Their lives were brutal labor, no freedom, subject to the will of their owner. A chieftain's wealth and ability to raid were often supported by the agricultural labor of his thralls back home. It's a stark reminder that the freedom, often associated with Vikings, primarily applied to the free class. Between the dramatic, sagas of raiding and adventure, this was the bedrock reality of Viking life. Hard work, community, tradition, faith, and the constant struggle for survival in a challenging environment. For Ragnar Lothbrok, this was the source of the men he led, the wealth he returned to, and the family dynasty he hoped to build. Now we come to the dramatic climax of Ragnar Lothbrok's saga, his death. According to the tale, seeking to outdo his famous sons, Ragnar launched a raid on England with only 2 ships filled with warriors. He landed in Northumbria, a powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom, where he was eventually defeated and captured by King Aella. The saga then describes a gruesome end. Ragnar was thrown into a pit full of venomous snakes, where he died, defiantly reciting verses about how his sons would avenge him. His final words, often quoted, are, "How the young pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." Let's ground this in history. Did Ragnar Lothbrok raid England? Perhaps. Vikings certainly raided England extensively in the early and mid-9th century. Was there a powerful King Aelle of Northumbria who fought Vikings? Yes, Aelle was king of Northumbria in the mid-9th century and is recorded as having fought against Viking invaders. Was Ragnar thrown into a snake pit? This is highly unlikely to be a literal historical event. Snake pits, as a form of execution, are not widely recorded, and venomous snakes capable of quickly killing a man in this manner are not native to England in sufficient numbers. This death is likely a dramatic, legendary invention, perhaps symbolizing the chaotic, painful end of a great hero. However, what followed this legendary death is one of the most significant events of the Viking Age. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in East Anglia in 865 AD. This was a massive force, much larger than typical raiding parties, and historical chronicles from the time, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, meticulously record its movements and actions. The leaders of this army are often named as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, figures consistently identified in the sagas as sons of Ragnar. Lothbrok. The sagas provide the powerful motive for this invasion: revenge for their father's death at the hands of Aelle. Imagine the sons hearing the news, perhaps brought by a survivor of Ragnar's ill-fated raid. The fury, the grief, the absolute imperative for vengeance in a society built on honor and retribution. This narrative provides a compelling reason for the scale and purpose of the great army: not just plunder, but conquest and the destruction of the man and kingdom responsible for the death of their legendary father. Historically, the motivations for such a large-scale invasion were likely more complex, as mentioned earlier: seeking land, responding to political shifts in Scandinavia, exploiting the disunity of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But the saga of Ragnar's death and the subsequent revenge invasion provides a powerful human story that binds these events together. Let's consider the reality of the Great Heathen Army's arrival. It wasn't a quick strike. It was a sustained military campaign. Landing in East Anglia, they forced the local king to provide them with horses and supplies. Then they moved north, targeting Northumbria. They captured Jorvik, a major city, in 866 AD. King Aelle and his rival Osbert, Northumbria, was in a civil war, united to try and retake the city in 867 AD. But they were defeated, and both kings were killed. The sagas describe a particularly brutal death for Aelle at the hands of Ragnar's sons, the Blood Eagle. This is a gruesome ritual execution where the victim's ribs are supposedly cut from the spine and spread open like wings, and the lungs pulled out. Whether the blood eagle was a real Viking practice is fiercely debated by historians and archaeologists. There's no contemporary evidence for it, and the descriptions appear only in much later sagas and poems, often in mythological contexts. Like the snake pit, it might be a literary invention, a potent symbol of ultimate vengeance and cruelty, rather than a historical method of execution. But the idea of it reinforces the brutal nature of the conflict and the scale of the sons. Retribution. The Great Heathen Army didn't stop with Northumbria. Over the next decade, they campaigned throughout England, conquering East Anglia, Mercia, and challenging Wessex, the kingdom ruled by Alfred the Great. It was a period of intense warfare, upheaval, and transformation for England. Imagine the experience of living in England during this time. The sudden appearance of the Viking fleet, the terrifying reputation of the invaders preceding them, the speed and ferocity of their attacks, the sacking of monasteries and towns, the sight of foreign warriors marching through the countryside, the constant fear, the uncertainty of who would be next. If you were an Anglo-Saxon farmer, you might see your crops burned, your livestock stolen, your family threatened, maybe even taken into slavery. If you were part of the local levy, you'd be called to arms, facing seasoned warriors in brutal, close-quarters combat. For the Vikings in the Great Army, it was a relentless campaign. Marches through unfamiliar territory, battles against determined defenders, periods of occupying conquered land, building fortifications like the winter camps described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, enduring English winters, dealing with disease, and constantly needing supplies. It was far more organized and sustained than earlier smash-and-grab raids. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok dying and his sons launching a massive revenge invasion provides a powerful, if legendary, origin story for this pivotal moment. It links the actions of the legendary father to the very real historical impact of his alleged sons, showing how myth and history could intertwine and influence the narrative of the past. Ragnar's legendary death spurred the actions of historical figures whose campaigns reshaped the map of Britain and left an indelible mark on history. Life in the Viking Age was deeply intertwined with belief in the supernatural. The line between the mundane world and the realm of gods, spirits, and magic was blurry. This wasn't just formal religion. It was woven into daily life, influencing decisions, explaining the inexplicable, and providing a framework for understanding a chaotic and dangerous world. We've touched on the Norse gods: Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, magic, poetry, and war; Thor, god of thunder, protector of mankind; Freya, goddess of love, beauty, fertility, gold, and also death and battle, claiming half of fallen warriors for her hall, Folkvanger, the other half going to Odin in Valhalla. There was Freyr, god of fertility, sunlight, and rain, crucial for agriculture; Tyr, god of law and heroic glory; Loki, the trickster god, source of both aid and immense trouble. Their stories, the myths we know from the Eddas, written down much later but based on older traditions, were more than just tales. They explained the creation of the world, the forces of nature, the origins of human society, and the eventual fate of the cosmos in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. These myths were likely recounted around the fire in the longhouse, teaching lessons about bravery, cunning, honor, and the unpredictable nature of the world. Magic, known as Seder, was a real and powerful concept. It was often associated with women, particularly the volur, seeresses or prophetesses, who could supposedly see and influence fate, communicate with spirits, and cast spells. They were respected and feared figures in society. Men who practiced Seder were often looked down upon as unmanly. Imagine the hushed reverence and fear when a vulva arrived at a settlement, her pronouncements listened to intently for clues about the future or the will of the gods. Superstitions were everywhere. Small carved figures or amulets worn for protection. Thor's hammer was the most common, but others represented various gods or symbols. Charms were used for healing, for ensuring a good harvest, for success in battle, or for cursing enemies. Specific rituals were performed for luck before a journey, a hunt, or a battle. Omens were sought in everything: the flight of birds, the patterns in smoke, dreams. Everything could be a sign from the gods or other supernatural forces. The concept of word, or fate, was perhaps the most fundamental belief shaping the Viking worldview. It was seen as an inescapable web woven by the Norns, female beings who determined destiny, binding everyone and everything. This didn't mean people were passive. Their actions within the web of fate still mattered and contributed to its pattern. This belief could instill a certain fatalism, but also encourage incredible bravery in the face of death. If your fate was to die, you might as well face it with courage, potentially earning a place in Valhalla. Imagine a Viking warrior, perhaps one of Ragnar's men, preparing for a raid. He might wear a protective amulet, make a small offering to Odin for victory or Tyr for courage, look for favorable omens, and steel himself with the knowledge that his ultimate fate is already determined. Only the manner of his death is up to him and the circumstances of battle. This mindset could make them incredibly dangerous and seemingly fearless opponents. Afterlife beliefs were varied. As mentioned, Valhalla and Folkvanger were for those who died heroically. Others might go to Helheim, a place that wasn't necessarily a Christian hell of torment, but rather a cold, gloomy realm for those who died of sickness or old age. Funerary practices reflected the belief in a journey after death. Ship burials, like the famous Oseberg or Gokstad finds, were elaborate affairs. For high-status individuals, providing the deceased with everything they might need in the afterlife. A ship for travel, weapons, tools, food, drink, even sacrificed animals and thralls. Other burials were simpler, but often included grave goods. The mound built over a grave was seen as the dwelling place of the deceased, where their spirit might reside or pass through. The world was also populated by other beings: Jötnar, giants, elves, dwarves, land spirits, vetir, who inhabited the natural landscape and needed to be respected lest they cause trouble. Travel could be dangerous not just from humans and weather, but from unseen forces. While the sagas sometimes portray a world where gods directly intervene or heroes have almost divine protection, the underlying beliefs were much more about living in a world where powerful, often capricious forces were constantly at play. Success and survival depended on understanding and respecting these forces, using available magic and ritual, and accepting the hand of fate with courage. For Ragnar Lothbrok, his legendary status meant he was seen as someone favored by the gods, whose life and death had cosmic significance within this rich tapestry of belief. In the sagas, Ragnar Lothbrok is defined not just by his own actions, but by his sons. And historically, the figures claimed as his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Ubba, and others, were absolutely central to the next phase of Viking expansion, particularly the massive incursions into England in the mid-9th century. The concept of family and lineage was crucial in Viking society, particularly among the elite. Power and influence were often inherited, but they also had to be constantly asserted and defended. A chieftain needed loyal kinsmen and a strong reputation. Marriages were often strategic alliances between powerful families. Having many sons was seen as a blessing and a source of strength. More warriors, more potential allies, more ways to extend influence. Ragnar's saga portrays him as a man with numerous wives and concubines, siring many sons, each with distinct characteristics or destinies. Ivar the Boneless, often described as cunning, intelligent, and strategically brilliant, though physically disabled, hence boneless, the meaning debated, maybe indicating flexibility, lack of bones, or a different physical condition. In the sagas and historical chronicles, he is a key leader of the great heathen army that invaded England. Bjorn Ironside, a great warrior, said to have raided widely, including into the Mediterranean. Halfdan Ragnarsson, another prominent leader of the great heathen army in England, later ruling in Northumbria. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, named for a distinctive mark in his eye, said to have inherited territories in Denmark and Scandinavia. Ubba, often associated with Ivar and Halfdan in the English campaigns, though his parentage is sometimes disputed in sources. The sagas depict tensions and rivalries between Ragnar and his sons, and among the sons themselves. Ragnar is sometimes shown as being jealous of his sons' fame or daring them to greater feats. This reflects the historical reality of power struggles and competition within elite Viking families and between different groups of Vikings. Succession wasn't always smooth. While a son might inherit his father's lands and title, this often had to be backed up by force or political maneuvering. Reputation was key. A chieftain needed to be seen as generous, capable in battle, wise in judgment, and successful in acquiring wealth, often through raids. If a son couldn't live up to this, or if there were multiple ambitious sons, conflict was likely. Imagine the dynamics in Ragnar's longhouse as his sons grew up. Sons of different mothers, each likely vying for their father's favor and a share of his power and wealth, listening to the tales of their father's exploits, eager to prove themselves and surpass him, learning the skills of warfare, seamanship, negotiation, and leadership, observing the political alliances and rivalries that shaped their world. The sagas also describe the sons undertaking their own raids and expeditions, sometimes at Ragnar's instigation. This was a part of their training, their way of building their own reputation and wealth separate from their father. Bjorn Ironside's alleged Mediterranean raid, for instance, involved a massive fleet and campaigns that took him far from Scandinavia, a truly epic undertaking requiring incredible logistical skill and daring. The historical reality of these sons leading the great heathen army that landed in England in 865 AD is undeniable. This wasn't a quick raid, it was a sustained invasion aiming for conquest and settlement. They campaigned for years, defeating Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, conquering territories, and eventually establishing the Danelaw in eastern England. While the sagas attribute this invasion specifically to avenging Ragnar's death, which we'll get to, the historical forces driving it were likely more complex. Growing populations in Scandinavia, internal political pressures, and the proven wealth and relative vulnerability of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The sagas provide a compelling, human-scale explanation for this massive historical event, revenge for the death of their famous father. This narrative structure gives meaning to the chaos and scale of the invasion, making it a personal story of a dynasty's rise and vengeance. Whether true or not, it was a powerful story that linked the legendary past to the very real and disruptive events of the late 9th century. Understanding the importance of family, power dynamics, and the desperate quest for reputation helps us understand the motivations behind the Viking expansion, whether led by the legendary Ragnar or the historical figures like his powerful sons. It was a world where lineage mattered, but personal achievement and strength of will mattered even more. Ragnar Lothbrok, the man of saga and legend, may not have existed exactly as the stories portray him, but the age he represents and the events linked to his legendary sons are undeniably real and profoundly shaped the course of European history. How did the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok become so prominent? The stories were told and retold for generations, part of the oral tradition of the Norse world. They were entertainment, history lessons of a sort, and moral tales about heroism, fate, and the importance of reputation and family honor. When Icelanders began writing down the sagas in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, Ragnar's tale, with its epic scope, famous children, and dramatic ending, was a natural fit for the literary format. These written sagas then became a key source, though a problematic one historically, for understanding the Viking Age. The historical impact of figures claimed as Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Bjorn Ironside, is well documented. Outside the sagas, their campaigns in England didn't just involve raiding, they led to settlement. The Danelaw wasn't just conquered territory. It became an area with a significant Scandinavian population, influencing language, place names, law, and culture. Jorvik became a major Viking kingdom and trading hub. Viking activity wasn't limited to England and Francia. From the 9th to the 11th centuries, Norsemen raided, traded, explored, and settled across vast distances. The British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, North America, briefly, Russia, the Byzantine Empire, the Mediterranean. Bjorn Ironside's alleged Mediterranean raid, even if details are exaggerated in sagas, reflects real Viking activity in that region. Swedish Vikings, often called Russ, established trade routes through Eastern Europe, founding cities and forming the basis of what would become Kievan Rus, the precursor state to modern Russia and Ukraine. The Viking Age generally dated from the late 8th century, like the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, to the mid-11th century, like the Battle of Hastings in 1066, which involved descendants of Vikings, was a period of immense change driven by Norse expansion. It wasn't just about violence. It was also about trade, exploration, cultural exchange, and the eventual assimilation of Vikings into the societies they settled in, particularly as they converted to Christianity. The decline of the Viking Age came about for several reasons. The kingdoms in Scandinavia became more unified and centralized under powerful kings, like Harald Fairhair in Norway, Nut the Great ruling a North Sea empire. These kings often discouraged independent raiding or redirected that energy towards more organized conquest or crusades. The societies they raided also became better organized and defended, like Alfred the Great building fortresses and a navy in Wessex. And importantly, the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, a process that took centuries, fundamentally changed their relationship with Christian Europe, gradually integrating them into the wider European political and cultural sphere. But the legacy of the Vikings and figures like the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok endures. Their impact is visible in archaeology, ship burials, hoards of silver, settlements like Jorvik. In language, many English words have Old Norse roots. In place names, and in legal and political structures in areas like the Danelaw. And the legend? It never really went away. The sagas were preserved. In later centuries, as nationalism grew, Viking history and figures became symbols of strength, adventure, and national identity in Scandinavia. In the modern era, the romanticized image of the fierce horn-helmeted, historically inaccurate. By the way, Vikings didn't wear horns on their battle helmets. Warrior took hold in popular culture. The recent popularity of television shows and books featuring Ragnar Lothbrok shows the enduring fascination with this figure and the era he represents. These modern portrayals often blend the saga myths with historical elements, creating compelling drama, but further blurring the lines between legend and reality. They capture the sense of adventure, the brutality, the family dynamics, and the clash of cultures that define the Viking Age in the popular imagination. So, while we may never know the precise historical truth of a single man named Ragnar Lothbrok, who did all the deeds attributed to him, the story of Ragnar serves as a powerful window into the Viking Age. It allows us to explore the real world, of longships and raids, farmsteads and feasts, gods and fate, families and dynasties, conquest and change. It reminds us of a time when the world was vast, dangerous, and full of unknown possibilities, when reputation was wealth, and when the line between history and legend was often deliberately and powerfully blurred. It was a challenging world, demanding courage, resilience, and pragmatism. A world where achieving true rest, free from the weight of labor, the threat of violence, or the anxieties of fate, was perhaps the rarest treasure of all. And so, we bring our journey through the world of Ragnar Lothbrok, legend and history, intertwined to a close. We've sailed the seas, walked the smoky floors of longhouses, felt the tension before a raid, and contemplated the beliefs that shaped a people. We've seen the harsh reality behind the romance, the sweat and grime that accompanied the glory, the profound differences from our own comfortable lives, and, perhaps, caught glimpses of shared human experiences. Ambition, fear, hope, the love of family, the search for meaning. Thinking about the Viking Age, especially through the lens of a life as epic as Ragnar's Saga, can make our own world feel incredibly safe and predictable by comparison. Imagine needing to scan the horizon constantly for danger, relying on muscle, power, and the wind to travel, accepting disease and hardship as daily facts of life. It gives you a certain perspective, doesn't it? As you settle deeper into your own safe, comfortable space, away from the creak of the longship and the smoke of the hearth, allow the details of this distant world to fade gently. The sounds of the wind and waves, the smells of tar and smoke, the feeling of rough wool and cold steel. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok, whether purely historical fact or powerful saga, reminds us of the incredible depth and complexity of the past, and how the lines between what was and what is told can become beautifully, fascinatingly blurred over time. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the Viking Age. If you found this journey into the past helpful for winding down, or simply fascinating, please consider leaving a like on the video. Subscribing to the channel helps us continue to explore these detailed corners of history together. And if you have a favorite detail or a question that came to mind during our time in Scandinavia, please share it in the comments below. I love reading your thoughts and insights. For now, let the sounds of this historical world recede. Drift away from the sagas and the shores of the past. Rest easy, sleep well. Good night.